Bonjour à tous. Welcome, Carlos. So we are going to speak in Canadian, a little bit of French and much of English. Je vais parler en français parce que si vous avez lu dans le programme, vous avez toute la présentation de Carlos Diaz, qui est un homme extrêmement intéressant dans son expérience professionnelle, puisqu'il a été un haut responsable du département de la défense aux États-Unis et un des acteurs importants de l'administration Trump à la Maison-Blanche. Depuis, il est effectivement à Miami et, comme ça vient d'être rappelé, à l'Institut Adam Smith. Et donc, il a une vision forcément extrêmement importante et intéressante dans le contexte international que nous vivons. And this is why I am especially happy to have this opportunity to discuss with you. First of all, Carlos, maybe before asking you questions about the US, given your experience, seen from also from the windows of the White House, what is your perception of Europe? How do you see Europe as in the world of today? Give me your real thoughts on that.
Bonjour des États-Unis, je suis ravi d'être ici à Paris, à l'OCDE, avec vous. That's a difficult question to talk about Europe in Europe as a foreigner, but I'll try. I'm concerned, to be honest. I think what I'm going to say is going to first sound a little US-centric and then a little Euro-centric, but there's a reason for it. I think a strong US is good for the world, it's good for peace. And a strong Europe is also good for peace and good for the world. And I'm concerned that given the geopolitical changes that we have seen in the past few years, whereas we're seeing changes of the type that we have not seen since the end of the Second World War, with a reorganization of the world order in which we have the United States on one hand and a rising China on the other hand, that if things continue the way they seem to be going, that Europe might fade into irrelevance, which is very, very concerning, because having a strong US-European relationship, I think, is vital, not only for commerce, for the economy, but also for world peace. And what we're seeing is, again, a rising China, a rising, call it developing world, breaks in other areas of the world. And Europe doesn't seem to be having a strong presence anymore. And I think that's concerning, and I think that has to change.
So on what criteria do you judge the weakness of Europe today? European corporations, are in good shape. They are global. They do a lot of good business. So why this judgment? Is it a matter of investment in forces, in defense? Is it the lack of unity eventually between governments? What's your criteria?
Well, the lack of unity is very interesting, because after centuries of wars and fighting, right now we have a European Union that politically could be a very powerful front, yet it doesn't seem to be that way. On multilateral organizations, the European voice is not as strong as it could be, in my opinion, or as it should be. And I think the issue is more political than economic. You know, European companies are doing fairly well. European companies are investing all over the world. It's just that they're not keeping pace with the competition, if you will.
What we see today is a new conflict. In the last century, it was a conflict, an ideological conflict between capitalism, socialism, communism, whatever. Today, we see a fight between the Western world and the rest of the world. We call that Deep South, whatever, and with the idea of a revenge, some kind of revenge, and a revisioning the past, attacking for colonialism, etc., etc. And this is also true within the US. There is a strong movement to support this kind of new vision. So, what is your comment on this?
Well, I think it's a new vision that stems from the unequal distribution of the benefits of globalization. I think everybody would argue that globalization, in general, has been good for countries, has been good for economies. However, the benefits of that globalization has not been fairly distributed amongst different segments of the population in Europe and in the United States. In the United States, for example, even though the U.S. has benefited from globalization, sectors within the U.S. economy have not. And they have seen a tremendous lack of displacement and resentment because they have not seen the benefits. So from a national perspective, what good is it if globalization raises the standard of living if you're not benefiting from those benefits? And so we see that in Europe as well, where certain segments of the population are not seeing the benefits of globalization. Therefore, they resent the globalization, and they turn to populism as a way to solve issues that could have been avoided in the first place if those benefits were distributed a little bit more fairly than they currently are, or than they have been for decades.
Okay, that's interesting. We will come back to that. But I think that everyone here is expecting to have your view on what's going to happen in the next year. So my first question is, what is the likelihood that we will have a battle between Biden and Trump at the next election?
Very, very high. I think I'll break the election into the two primaries, if you will. On the Democratic side, there is going to be no contest, in my opinion. It's going to be more of a symbolic gesture. There's no real opposition on the Democratic side. There's going to be no debates. There's going to be primaries, but they're going to be nominal. They're not going to be real contests. And I say primaries because we tend to think of primaries as one election in which the parties choose their nominee on one day. And that's not the case in the U.S. In the U.S., there's going to be 56 primaries for the Republicans and 56 primaries for the Democrats, one for each of the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the 5 territories of the U.S. abroad. And so the primaries will go from January until June, 56 different elections for each party, in some cases not even on the same day. Democrats one day, the Republicans on a different day. On the Republican side, there will be more of a contest in that there are several candidates. However, as it stands right now, 2 months roughly before the first vote is cast in the first primary, it's actually a caucus in Iowa, it seems like Donald Trump is going to be the nominee. Anything can happen, but right now it's difficult to envision any other candidate rising up and presenting a real challenge for a couple of reasons. One, it's very difficult to compete with somebody who sucks the oxygen out of every room. He commands attention like nobody else can. He's able to shape the debate in a way that nobody else really can. Added to that, great name recognition. But second, you have a very divided field on the Republican side. It is true that President Trump has a very solid floor. No matter what, he can do whatever he wants. No matter what, he has a solid floor that I think is roughly around 35%. No matter what, he will get roughly 35% of the Republican vote. But he also has a ceiling, and that ceiling had traditionally been around 50%. Now it seems to be a little higher. But if your ceiling is roughly 50%, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, and you have two people running for the presidency, it's possible that the second person could present a challenge. But you don't have a second person. You have a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth. You have, roughly about a dozen candidates. And so when you have that many candidates, and, little by little they're dropping out, but when you have that many candidates, it's possible to win the nomination with that 35% or 40%, because the other one's split the opposition. And so the only real chance for anybody other than Trump is for there to be eventually two candidates. I think the logical choice would be the governor of Florida.
Or a legal problem.
So I don't think a legal issue, maybe a health issue, but he seems to be very healthy and very strong. The legal issues don't seem to be having any negative effect. In fact, they're having a positive effect. There's nothing that's going to prevent him from running, no legal issue. The U.S. Constitution is very clear to be able to run for president.
Is in the American law, is it possible to be impeached to have, in terms of civil rights, impeached to be candidate? Is that possible?
He can't be impeached because he's not in office anymore, but as long as he meets three requirements in the Constitution, as long as he has the residency requirement, as long as he has the age requirement, and as long as he was born in the U.S., if you meet those three requirements, you can run for office, even if you have 5 indictments, 100 indictments, it doesn't matter. Technically, he can be found guilty and still run. That doesn't prevent him from running. In fact, what we're seeing is that every time he's accused of something, his numbers go up and his fundraising goes up dramatically. And I think part of the reason is that it feeds the narrative that he has been saying since he launched his campaign over 7 years ago, the first campaign. And that is that the system is out to get him. And if this type of political persecution could happen to a multi-billionaire former president of the United States, it could happen to you and to you and to you and to everybody. And he would say, and I am the only one who can prevent that from happening. So that narrative is consistent with all these legal issues. And so that's actually helping him. I don't see any scenarios, zero, in which he will be prevented from running because of the legal issues. If he has, tons and tons of lawsuits, most of them are civil lawsuits. He has 4 criminal indictments, 2 in state courts, 2 in federal courts. Those are not going to be heard anytime soon. The earliest that they're going to begin to be heard is in the spring. That's going to take a few months for the cases to be heard. There will be a verdict. If that verdict is not guilty, easy, he continues. If the verdict is guilty, he appeals. That appeal will take months, if not years. Under no circumstances do I see a final verdict after the first appeal and after the second appeal, which would go to the Supreme Court. Under no circumstances would that happen before the election.
Yes.
So there's no way, in my opinion, that a legal issue will prevent him from running or winning.
Okay, that's clear. So let's assume Trump is candidate and is elected. Could you very quickly explain what would be the main changes and the one that could touch the Western world in general and Europe especially?
Sure.
Internal policy through economics mainly and
Sure.
International policy.
I think you would see on the economic front a lot of continuity from the first Trump administration. I don't see any major changes. The agenda of tax cuts, the agenda of deregulation, we talked about deregulation in the previous panel, a very aggressive deregulatory agenda I think will continue. On the foreign front, I think you're also going to see a lot of continuity from the first administration, emphasis on the America First foreign policy, which I think has been misunderstood. America First doesn't mean America alone, but it does mean, from his perspective, that he is elected president of the United States, not Secretary General of the UN. And so you're going to see a lot of emphasis on that agenda. But I do think you're going to see a slight change in that there's going to be a laser focus on using all the resources of the federal government and the United States of America in the fight against China. I think in the first administration, you saw a great emphasis on that, but you also saw a lot of other side arguments, side fights, a lot of distracting issues. And I do think you're going to see a greater focus on the Chinese threat, which is real, and in my opinion, the biggest threat facing the world right now. And that means that there might be a greater propensity to strengthen ties with our natural allies, which would be Europe, which would be the Western Hemisphere, which will be countries that little by little have seen a rising turn towards China, and if we're serious about the Chinese threat, the only way to really prevent them from rising to the level where they want to rise is to bring our allies together. And again, Latin America and Europe are the two most logical partners to pair up with in that fight.
Okay, so some quick, easy questions. NATO.
I think that this is a very, very hot issue in Europe, because I think the perception is that if President Trump is reelected, he's going to get rid of NATO. I think the probability of the U.S. Stepping away from NATO is close to zero. I think the United States, President Trump understands the importance of NATO as a vital alliance between the U.S., Canada, Western Europe. There's no question that it has been an indispensable defense pact agreement. I think what you're going to see is what you saw, which is an insistence that European countries pay their fair share, an insistence that we go back to that commitment of spending 2% in defense, which very few European countries actually meet. And so you're going to see probably a continued rhetoric, tough rhetoric, saying, yes, NATO is important to the U.S., but guess what? It's more important for Europe, and you should be paying part of your defense. And so you got to step up to the game and pay your 2%. You're going to see that, but I don't see any scenario in which the U.S. pulls out of NATO at all.
What about Ukraine?
With Ukraine, I think what you're going to see is continued support for Ukraine, but no longer what we might call unconditional support, in the sense of sending billions and billions of dollars without accountability. I think we're going to see, and we're seeing this already in the Congress, in the Republican half of the Congress, in which the Republican majority supports Ukraine, but not unconditionally, meaning that I think the U.S. government will demand more accountability. The U.S. government will demand that taxpayer dollars be spent wisely, that efforts are made to avoid corruption, local corruption, that accountability is up in the center of those funds.
Yeah, well, these kind of things you can you can claim for that in a normal situation, not in the middle of a war. So the question is Mr. Putin right in being a big fan of the election of Mr. Trump?
I think so. I think that's another misperception, that that they're friends, that they're buddies. I think President Trump believes, you might disagree and say this is wrong, but I think he believes that he could pick up the phone and talk to Putin and resolve the issue in a way that hasn't been resolved. And so the answer to that is either yes or no. If it's yes, great. If it's no, I don't think you're going to see any type of support for the war in Ukraine on the Russian side at all. I think the support for Ukraine is going to continue. And saying that we're in the middle of a war, therefore we can attach strings to the aid, is not going to fly in the U.S., because there are a lot of people in the U.S., forget about politicians, forget about Republicans or Democrats, there are a lot of voters in the U.S., in the middle of the country, who are saying, it's great that we're supporting Ukraine, it's a good cause, they were invaded in a vicious and brutal way. However, there are a lot of issues in the U.S. There's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of social issues, and why should I be spending taxpayer dollars in a war that is thousands of kilometers away, when there's so many issues locally? So there's going to be a lot of domestic pressures to put some strings attached to that aid, which might not be a bad idea, because after all, foreign aid should have strings attached to it, and those strings have to lead back to the national interest of the United States or of any country that is given the aid.
Okay, let's fly to another crisis, Middle East. What would be the difference between what is today the policy of Biden towards Israel and the situation? What would be different, if, according to you, of course, if Trump was in office today?
I think the main difference would be more clarity in the support for Israel. Right now, I think on the Democrat side, there seems to be a little bit of an ambivalence. The administration, all the spokespeople, everything that comes out of the National Security Council seems to be in support of Israel, but there are very loud elements of the Democrat Party who are not voicing that concern. And so I think the main difference would be the clarity in which a potential Republican administration, be Trump or be whomever, would be in support of Israel. More clear, more resolute, more definitive than you see right now, which is mixed signals. Some supportive statements on one hand, but other statements on the other hand that seem to contradict. So I think the main difference would be clarity.
Clarity at the price of eventually difficulties with the Arabic world,
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia, which is a close. And are you more generally supporting of the agreement of between Israel, Saudi Arabia,
The Abraham Accords?
Yes, Abraham.
Yeah, so that's one area that hasn't been talked about a whole lot. During the administration, we were able to achieve, a historic agreement between Israel and three Arab countries that we haven't seen since the peace deal with Egypt, and so I think that is on solid ground. I don't see that changing. There's no question that the U.S. supports Israel, but there's also no question that the U.S. needs to have good relationship with the Arab neighborhood, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. They're strategic partners, and it's not, in my opinion, it's not one or the other. It's both.
What about Iran?
Iran's a very, very complicated one, and I think that it's probably in the Middle East the area where you're going to see the biggest change in policy, not just in the rhetoric, but in the actual policy. President Trump, in his first term, was very clear in pulling the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal, and in a second potential administration, I think that is going to be very clearly the policy, very aggressive, maximum pressure against Iran. And no negotiating, no easing of sanctions. And so if you ask me in the Middle East, what would be the biggest change from the current policy? I think Iran will be the biggest change. A much tougher maximum pressure campaign on Iran, which we know is funding Hamas and Hezbollah. And there's going to be no second guessing there.
They're not the only ones who finance Hezbollah.
But they're the main ones.
Yeah. And this is including the nuclear danger and the fact that Israel has never accepted the idea that Iran could have a nuclear war.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We have supposed. Thank you for explaining what would be the difference if Trump was elected. What's going to happen in the U.S. if Trump is not elected and defeated by as in all the recent elections, with a very small, if not eventually more votes, but less states. So what will be how the American society could react and in front of this kind of situation, given its polarization?
Sure. Very, very tough question. And before I answer that one, one thing about one added answer to the previous question is a lot of people like what Trump stands for. A lot of people don't like what Trump stands for. But I think what you're going to see is a clear effort to follow through on campaign promises. Again, you might love the campaign promises. You might hate the campaign promises and think they're not good. But you're going to see an effort to keep those promises. What you see is what you get. There's going to be clarity, and there's not going to be any ambiguity. He's going to be very clear about what he's going to do, and there's no question about that. You're going to get clarity and resolve. What's going to happen if the election doesn't go his way and it's very close? I think regardless, it's going to be very, very close. As you rightly pointed out, the election of 2016 was decided by roughly 40-some thousand votes spread out strategically in a handful of states. The election of 2020 was decided strategically by about 70,000 votes in a handful of states. So it's very likely that the next election, whichever way it goes, will be decided by a few thousand votes strategically spaced out in a few states. What happens if he doesn't win and it's that close? It's a very good question. A lot of it will have to do with what he says. His supporters are very, very loyal to him, and if it doesn't go his way, and he is convinced that it was fair, that's an easy one. If he's convinced that it was not fair, I don't see a scenario in which he just fades away and says thank you very much. I think you're going to see a lot of litigation, and I think you're going to see a lot of angry people on the streets who feel that it was robbed from them. But a lot of it will depend on how he handles it and what the rhetoric is if the election doesn't go his way and it's very, very close.
Well, we had 5 seconds, so thank you very much, Carlos, and we have 1 year ahead to see what's going on in the US. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.